He asks it before he's even fully at your window. Do you know why I stopped you tonight? Casual, almost bored, like he's asking what you had for dinner. And here's what nobody tells you about that exact question. It is, statistically, the single most successful question in an officer's entire toolkit. Not because it's clever, but because it works on decent people almost every time. And it works because of something built into good, honest human nature that has absolutely nothing to do with guilt. Before I explain why that question is so dangerous, and exactly what to say instead, if you want the kind of information that actually helps you the next time blue lights show up in your rearview mirror, instead of leaving you guessing in the moment, hit subscribe right now, because that's exactly what this channel is built to give you, one real scenario at a time. Quick note before we dive in. This is legal education and commentary, not legal advice for your specific situation, and laws shift a little from state to state, but the core principle here holds up almost everywhere in the country. Now let's get into exactly why this one question matters so much, and exactly what you need to know before you ever open your mouth to answer it. Let's start with what's actually happening inside that question, because understanding the mechanics is what makes the solution obvious, instead of something you have to force yourself to remember under pressure. Do you know why I stopped you? Sounds like an invitation to a conversation. It is not a conversation. It is, functionally, a request for a confession, dressed up as small talk. Think about what the officer is actually asking you to do. He already knows why he stopped you. He watched you do whatever it was, or he ran your plate, and saw whatever came back, or he clocked your speed on radar before he ever hit the lights. He has the answer. He's not asking because he's missing information. He's asking because he wants you to supply that information yourself, out loud, in your own words, on the record. Because an admission that comes from your own mouth is worth more to him than almost anything else he could gather in that entire stop. Here's why this works so well on honest people specifically, and I want you to really sit with this, because it's the whole key to the entire video. Guilty people, statistically, tend to be more guarded in these interactions, more careful with their words, because they know exactly what they're worried about and they're bracing for it. Honest people are often the ones who talk the most, because they have nothing they're consciously trying to hide, so their instinct is to be open, cooperative, forthcoming, to prove, through their friendliness and honesty, that they're one of the good ones. That instinct is beautiful in almost every other context of life. In this one specific context, it's exactly the vulnerability that question is designed to find. So someone gets asked, "Do you know why I stopped you?" and their brain does something very human and very understandable. It starts scanning backward through the last few minutes, trying to figure out what they might have done wrong. And then, because silence feels awkward and guessing feels cooperative, they offer up a guess. "I think I might have been going a little over the limit back there." And in that single sentence, something has changed permanently. 30 seconds ago, there was no recorded admission that this driver was speeding. Now there is one, in the driver's own voice, easy to write into a report, easy to reference later, easy to use as the foundation for exactly the outcome the driver was hoping to avoid. Nobody forced that admission out. Nobody threatened it into existence. It was volunteered, freely, by someone trying to be polite and cooperative, because that's what decent people do when someone in authority asks them a direct question. Now here's the part that makes this even more important to understand. The guess is very often wrong anyway. People assume the reason is whatever's most obviously top of mind, usually speed, and guess accordingly, when the actual reason might be something completely different. A tail light out, an expired tag they didn't notice, a rolling stop at an intersection 3 blocks back that they didn't even register as anything unusual. So not only does the guess hand over an admission, it very often hands over an admission to something that wasn't even the actual reason for the stop, adding a completely unnecessary confession on top of whatever the real issue turns out to be. You can genuinely make your situation worse by guessing wrong in a stop where the officer's actual reason was something minor and easily resolved. So here's what you need to know before you ever answer that question, and this is the entire heart of this video. You are under no obligation to guess. None. Guessing is not politeness. Guessing is not cooperation. Guessing is simply handing over information you're not required to provide, in response to a question that was never actually asking for your help. It was asking for your confession, phrased gently enough that most people never notice the difference. Here's the sentence, and I want you to say it out loud right now, in your own voice, so it's not foreign to you the first time you actually need it. "I'm not sure, officer. What's the reason for the stop?" That's the whole sentence. You've answered completely honestly because you genuinely don't know, out of all the possible reasons, which one actually brought him to your window. And you've done something else just as important. You've put the burden of stating a reason back exactly where it belongs, on him, because he's the one who's supposed to have a specific, articulable reason for pulling you over in the first place. And that reason is his to state, not yours to guess at on his behalf. Let's talk about why this simple redirection matters so much, beyond just avoiding an accidental confession, because there's a deeper legal principle sitting underneath it that's worth understanding fully. For a traffic stop to be lawful in the first place, an officer generally needs what's called reasonable suspicion, a specific, articulable reason to believe a traffic law was violated or that criminal activity is afoot. This isn't a high bar, and it doesn't need to hold up to intense scrutiny in the moment, but it does need to exist, and it needs to be something the officer can actually state if asked. When you ask what's the reason for the stop instead of guessing, you're not being difficult and you're not being evasive. You're simply requiring the process to work the way it's actually supposed to work, with the officer stating his own justification rather than you inadvertently supplying one for him. If his actual reason is legitimate, you were speeding, you rolled through a stop sign, your registration is expired, he'll simply tell you, and nothing about your response has cost you anything at all. If his actual reason is thin or questionable, you haven't handed him anything extra to work with by guessing incorrectly on his behalf, and that thin reason stays exactly as thin as it started out, something an attorney can examine properly later, instead of something you accidentally reinforced on the roadside. Now, let's widen this out, because the "do you know why I stopped you" question rarely stands alone. It's almost always the opening move in a sequence, and understanding the whole sequence is what lets you handle each piece calmly, instead of getting caught off guard by whatever comes next. The sequence typically goes something like this. First, the friendly opener. How's it going tonight? Where you folks headed? Something warm and low stakes designed simply to get you talking and lower your guard before anything substantive is even asked. Second, the confession question we just spent all this time on. Do you know why I stopped you? Third, if that doesn't produce anything useful, the travel questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Whose car is this? Who's that in the passenger seat? Fourth, if rapport has built up enough by this point, the search request. You don't have anything in the car I should know about, do you? Mind if I take a look? And running underneath the entire sequence, the two things that are actually mandatory, quietly handled at some point along the way, confirming your identity, and if you're driving, producing your license, registration, and insurance. I want to walk through each stage of this with you, because knowing where the "do you know why I stopped you" question sits inside this larger structure is what makes it possible to handle the whole encounter calmly, instead of just the one question. Stage 1, the friendly opener. This isn't really a question that needs an answer beyond basic politeness. How's it going tonight? Gets a short, warm, forgettable response. Doing fine, officer, thanks. And nothing more. You're not required to explain your evening, your mood, your destination, or anything else at this stage, and offering extra detail here accomplishes nothing except giving the officer material before he's even asked for anything specific. Warm and brief, that's the whole strategy for this stage. Stage 2, the confession question, which is what this entire video has been building toward. Do you know why I stopped you tonight? Never guess. I'm not sure, officer, what's the reason for the stop? Said calmly, said plainly. No defensiveness in your tone, because there's nothing to be defensive about. You're simply answering honestly and redirecting the question back to where it actually belongs. Stage 3, the travel questions. And this is where I want to spend some real time, because it's closely related to the confession trap, but works a little differently. Where are you coming from tonight? Where are you headed? Who's that in the car with you? These feel like conversation, but they're functioning as data collection. Every detail you volunteer here becomes a thread that can be pulled on later, and if your account doesn't line up perfectly with a passenger's account, or with the time of night, or with the direction you were driving, you've handed over exactly the kind of detail that shows up constantly in police reports across the country, described as inconsistent or evasive statements, treated as a building block toward reasonable suspicion of something more. You are not required to narrate your evening. You've already satisfied your actual legal obligation once you've identified yourself and handed over your documents if you're driving. Everything about your itinerary lives entirely in the optional zone, and the sentence that closes that zone without a fight is simple. I'd rather not get into that, officer. Am I free to go? Stage 4, the search request. And this is the moment where everything we've covered matters most, because this is where an accidental yes costs you something real and permanent. You don't have anything in the car I should know about, do you? Mind if I take a quick look? I want you to hear this clearly, because it's the single most consequential moment in the entire encounter. Under the Fourth Amendment, an officer generally needs one of three things to search your vehicle: a warrant, probable cause, or your consent. Consent is the only one of those three that requires nothing from him beyond your agreement, and the instant you give it, the other two protections stop mattering, because you voluntarily handed over the one thing the Constitution said he could never simply take from you by force. He does not have to tell you that you have the right to refuse. Courts have upheld that an officer can ask this question while knowing perfectly well you're entitled to say no, with absolutely no obligation to mention that fact to you. He doesn't even have to tell you that you're free to leave before he asks. The whole request can be phrased in a tone that makes refusal feel awkward or even impossible, when the truth is, you have every choice in the world sitting right there in front of you. Here's why good, honest people fall for it every single time it's tried. The instinct is always some version of the same thought. I've got nothing to hide, so why would I say no? Saying no makes me look guilty. That instinct is decent, understandable, and completely human, and it's exactly what gets exploited. People consent to searches of vehicles they haven't cleaned out in months, cars a friend borrowed the weekend before, cars with a passenger's forgotten item tucked somewhere the driver never even knew about. And in an instant, someone who did absolutely nothing wrong is standing on the shoulder of the road in handcuffs over something they didn't even know was there, all because saying yes felt more polite than saying no. The sentence here matters just as much as the one for the confession question, and I want it sitting right next to it in your memory. Officer, I don't consent to any searches. Calm. No explanation attached. No justification tacked onto the end, because justifying it just opens a debate you don't need to have standing on the shoulder of a road at night. If he pushes back with something like, well, if you've got nothing to hide, you wouldn't mind, and sometimes he will, you don't take the bait, you don't get defensive, you simply repeat exactly the same sentence. I understand, officer, but I still don't consent to any searches. If he mentions calling out a canine unit, you let him, and your response stays exactly the same, because declining consent is not obstruction, it's not suspicious, and it's not an admission of anything at all. It's a citizen exercising a right that exists specifically so that this exact decision belongs to you, not to him. Now let's step back and talk about the mandatory pieces sitting underneath all of this, because I don't want anything in this video to be confused with an instruction to be difficult or uncooperative, and there is a real, genuine legal obligation running through every one of these stages that you absolutely should follow. When you're lawfully stopped, you are required to identify yourself, and if you're driving, that expands to include producing your license, registration, and proof of insurance when asked. Hand these over calmly, with your hands visible, and it's worth narrating the movement before you make it. My registration's in the glove box, I'm going to reach for it now. Because removing surprise from your movements is one of the single most effective things you can do to keep the entire stop calm and short. This is the deal attached to the privilege of driving on public roads, and there's no getting around it, nor should you want to, because refusing to identify yourself during a lawful stop doesn't protect you at all. It simply turns a routine 2-minute stop into something far worse. So here's the framework underneath everything in this video, distilled all the way down. Physical compliance is mandatory. You follow every lawful order with your body, immediately, without hesitation, every single time, because that's what keeps the encounter safe and keeps it short. Verbal cooperation beyond identifying yourself is optional, and this is where your rights actually live. You can comply completely with your hands, stepping out of the car when told, keeping your hands visible, following every lawful instruction, while still declining, calmly and clearly, to guess at the reason for the stop, to narrate your evening, or to consent to a search. Comply with your hands, decline with your words. That's the entire structure, and it applies to nearly every stage of every encounter you could find yourself in. Let's talk about what happens if you're asked to step out of the vehicle, because this often comes right on the heels of the confession question and the travel questions, especially if the officer feels like he isn't getting anywhere with either. Yes, during a lawful stop, an officer can order you out of your car, and this power has been upheld by courts for decades, extending to passengers as well as drivers. This is not the moment to argue or resist. You comply, calmly, slowly, hands visible the entire time. But stepping out of your vehicle is not consent to anything. It's not consent to a search, and it's not consent to further questioning. It's simply compliance with a lawful physical order, and your mouth stays exactly where it was before you got out of the car. If the questioning resumes once you're standing on the pavement, you go right back to the same lines. I'd rather not get into that. Am I free to go? For the travel questions, I don't consent to any searches if that request comes up again out here instead of through the window. Let's talk about what happens if the stop starts to drag on, because this is often where people start to panic and start talking more than they intended to, simply out of a desire to speed things along. He walks back to his cruiser with your documents, and you sit there. 5 minutes, 10, 15. You start wondering what could possibly be taking this long. Here's what's often actually happening. Additional checks being run, backup potentially being called, sometimes a canine unit being requested before the stop officially wraps up. Here's the rule that protects you in this exact moment, and it matters a great deal. An officer generally cannot extend a traffic stop longer than the time reasonably necessary to handle the actual reason for the stop, unless he develops separate, independent, reasonable suspicion of another crime along the way. The stop has a defined purpose, and once that purpose is resolved, the justification for continuing to hold you resolves along with it. The way to use this knowledge without starting a fight you can't win on the roadside is simple. You ask, once, calmly, "Am I free to go?" That question forces a clear outcome. Either he says yes and you leave, or he has to acknowledge that you're being detained, which means the clock is now running against him, not you, because every additional minute without proper justification becomes something for a court to examine later, not something you need to argue about in the moment. Ask it politely, ask it once. If the answer is that you're being detained, you go quiet, wait it out without escalating, and save the real argument for the place arguments are actually decided. And speaking of going quiet, there's an important wrinkle here worth understanding fully, because it connects directly back to everything we've covered about the confession question. Simply going silent, without ever clearly stating that you're invoking your right to remain silent, doesn't automatically guarantee that silence can't be used against you later. Courts have addressed situations where someone simply stopped talking during questioning without ever announcing that they were exercising the right, and that unexplained silence was later treated almost like evidence rather than the protected exercise of a right. The safer approach, every time, is to say it out loud rather than just letting silence speak for itself. "Officer, I'm going to remain silent and I don't consent to any searches." Then, stop talking. That sentence is your shield, and it only works fully if you actually raise it clearly, in words, rather than hoping your silence gets correctly interpreted after the fact. Let's talk for a moment about tone, because everything in this video is about what to say, but how you say it genuinely matters just as much, and I don't want anyone walking away from this thinking the goal is to be cold, combative, or difficult on the roadside. Every single sentence we've covered works exactly the same, whether it's delivered warmly or delivered with an edge, and warmly is always the better choice. "I'm not sure, officer, what's the reason for the stop?" said with a friendly, easy tone, accomplishes exactly the same legal protection as the same words, said sharply, but it produces a completely different experience for everyone involved. Officers, like anyone else, respond better to calm and respectful people than to people who seem defensive or hostile, and there is no tension whatsoever between being polite and asserting your rights clearly. You can say, "Yes, sir," hand over your documents smoothly, smile, thank him for his time, and still decline every single thing beyond what's actually required, without a hint of confrontation in your voice. That combination, warm, brief, respectful, and firm, is the version of this encounter that goes the fastest, feels the safest, and protects you the most completely, all at the same time. Let's talk about a few related scenarios where this exact same confession question dynamic shows up outside of traffic stops, because the pattern is worth recognizing everywhere it appears, not just at the driver's side window. If you're stopped on foot and an officer asks something like, "You know why I'm talking to you tonight?" the same principle applies exactly the same way. You're not required to guess at his reasoning, and guessing wrong or right both carry the same risk of handing over information you weren't required to provide. "I'm not sure. Is there something specific I can help you with?" works here the same way the driving version does, redirecting the burden back to him instead of filling the silence with a guess. If you're questioned at a workplace or during any encounter where an investigator opens with something like, "Do you have any idea why we wanted to talk to you?" the exact same dynamic is at play, just in a different setting. an open-ended invitation designed to get you to supply information rather than requiring the investigator to state what they already know. The same redirection works here too. I'm not sure. What would you like to know? Keeps you from guessing your way into an accidental admission in a much higher stakes setting than a roadside stop. Even outside law enforcement entirely, this pattern of an open confession-style question shows up more than people realize, and recognizing it as a pattern, rather than treating every instance as a brand new situation, is genuinely one of the most useful mental habits this video can leave you with. The specific words change. The underlying structure, an authority figure inviting you to guess at something they already know, hoping you'll fill in a gap that works against you, stays remarkably consistent. Let's bring this all the way back around to where we started, because I want to leave you with one clean, simple framework instead of a long list of disconnected rules to try to remember separately. When an officer asks, "Do you know why I stopped you tonight?" the question is not actually asking for your help understanding the situation. It's inviting you to confess, wrapped in a tone friendly enough that most people never notice the invitation for what it is. You are never required to guess. Guessing risks handing over an accidental admission, and it often risks handing over an admission to the wrong thing entirely, since people tend to guess at whatever's most obviously top of mind, rather than the actual reason for the stop. The correct response is calm, honest, and complete. "I'm not sure, officer. What's the reason for the stop?" That single sentence protects you completely while costing you absolutely nothing, because you've answered truthfully and simply required the process to work exactly the way it's supposed to, with the officer stating his own justification instead of you supplying one for him by accident. Everything else in the encounter follows the same underlying structure. Identify yourself and produce your documents if you're driving, because that's genuinely required, and there's no benefit whatsoever to resisting it. Comply immediately and completely with every lawful physical order, because that's what keeps you safe and keeps the encounter short. And beyond those two things, decline calmly and consistently. Decline to guess at the reason for the stop. Decline to narrate your travel plans. Decline to consent to any search, using short, warm, unshakable sentences that never change, no matter how many times the same request comes back around, in a slightly different form. Let's go a layer deeper, because there's a whole dimension of this we haven't touched yet. What's actually happening on the officer's side of this exchange, from a training perspective, because understanding his side of it makes your side of it make a lot more sense. Officers are trained, explicitly, in interview and interrogation technique, and a huge part of that training centers on exactly the kind of open-ended, non-confrontational question we've been talking about, because open-ended questions consistently outperform direct accusations at producing useful information. A direct accusation, "I know you were speeding," puts someone on the defensive immediately, and defensive people clam up, get careful, start choosing their words. An open, casual question, "Do you know why I stopped you?" does the opposite. It doesn't feel like an accusation at all, so the guard that would normally go up in response to an accusation never actually goes up, and the person answering it is far more likely to speak freely, exactly the way they would answer any other casual question from anyone else in their day. This isn't a flaw in the officer's approach. It's a well-understood, well-taught technique, precisely because it works, and it works specifically because it doesn't feel like it's supposed to work at all. This is worth understanding because it reframes something important. The friendliness in that question isn't fake in the sense of being personally insincere. The officer may genuinely be a perfectly pleasant person having a perfectly normal night. But the structure of the question, regardless of the individual delivering it, is doing a specific job. And that job is to lower your guard enough that you'll supply something you weren't required to supply. Recognizing that the friendliness and the function are two separate things, that a question can be delivered warmly and still be functioning as an information gathering tool, is really the entire insight this whole video rests on. You don't need to become suspicious of every friendly interaction in your life because of this. You just need to recognize this one specific moment, with this one specific question, as a moment where the friendly tone and the actual purpose of the question are not the same thing, and respond accordingly, calmly, and without taking the tone personally in either direction. Let's talk about something else worth understanding. Why officers ask this question even in situations where the reason for the stop is completely obvious to everyone involved, blinking lights and all, because this happens constantly, and it's easy to assume the question only gets asked when there's genuine ambiguity about why you were pulled over. Even when the reason seems completely clear, you know you were speeding, you know your tag is expired, you know exactly what happened, the question still gets asked, because the value of it has nothing to do with clarifying an unclear situation, and everything to do with generating that voluntary, on-the-record admission we've talked about throughout this video. Knowing this changes how you should think about the question, even in situations where you're genuinely not confused about why you got pulled over. The obviousness of the reason doesn't change the value of declining to guess out loud. If it's genuinely obvious, he'll simply tell you when you redirect the question back to him, and nothing about your response has cost you anything at all, exactly the same as in a situation where the reason is genuinely unclear. Let's talk about a related version of this same pattern that shows up specifically after an accident, because the dynamics shift slightly here, and it's worth addressing directly. If you're involved in a collision and an officer arrives to take a report, you'll often hear some version of, "So what happened here?" or "Walk me through it." This feels different from a traffic stop because there's clearly been an actual incident, and it seems reasonable that someone would want to understand what occurred. And there is a genuine, practical difference here worth acknowledging. Insurance claims and basic accident reports do generally require some factual account of what happened for purposes entirely separate from any potential citation or charge. But there's still an important distinction to hold on to. Describing basic facts for accident report purposes, where your car was, which direction you were traveling, what you observed, is different from offering an opinion about fault, offering a guess about what you might have done wrong, or speculating about causes you're not certain of. You can provide the concrete, observable facts an accident report requires while still declining to speculate about fault or admit uncertainty about your own actions in a way that could be used against you later. "I was traveling north on Main Street when the collision occurred" is a fact. "I probably wasn't paying close enough attention" is a voluntary admission dressed up as a passing comment, and it's worth being just as careful here as anywhere else in this video, especially in a moment when emotions are running high and the instinct to explain yourself, apologize, or fill silence is even stronger than it is during a routine traffic stop. Let's talk about the moment right after you've used the redirect sentence, because this is a small detail that matters more than people expect. Once you've said, "I'm not sure, officer, what's the reason for the stop?" resist the urge to keep talking to fill the silence that follows. This is genuinely one of the hardest parts of the whole interaction, because a pause after you've spoken feels awkward, and the instinct to fill an awkward pause with more words is deeply ingrained in almost everyone. But that pause isn't a problem to be solved. It's simply the officer deciding what to say next, and letting it sit, calmly, without rushing to add anything else, is exactly the right move. If you follow your redirect sentence with a nervous addition like, "Not that I think I did anything wrong," or anything, "I just, wasn't paying attention to my speedometer," you've just undone the entire benefit of the redirect by volunteering exactly the kind of guess you were trying to avoid in the first place. Say the sentence, then stop, and let the silence be his to fill, not yours. Let's talk about what happens when there's a passenger in the car with you, because this adds a layer worth addressing specifically, since the confession question sometimes gets aimed at whoever seems most likely to answer, and sometimes gets asked to both people separately once you've each stepped out. If a passenger gets asked the same question, "Do you know why your driver got pulled over tonight?" the exact same principle applies to them, and it's worth having this conversation with anyone who regularly rides with you before it ever comes up for real. A passenger guessing, "Yeah, we were probably going a little fast," creates exactly the same accidental admission as the driver guessing it themselves. And it's just as avoidable with the same redirect. "I'm not sure. Is there something I can help you with?" It's worth a genuine, calm conversation with family members, especially teenagers who are newer drivers or newer passengers in these situations, about this exact scenario, because the pattern doesn't discriminate based on who happens to be sitting in which seat. Let's talk about something that comes up in the aftermath of stops more than people expect. What happens if you did guess, and you did make an admission, before you ever knew any of this? First, don't panic, and don't try to walk it back verbally in the moment, because attempting to retract or re-explain a statement on the roadside almost never helps and often creates additional confusing statements that complicate things further rather than clarifying them. Once something's been said, the best move is usually to simply stop adding to it. Invoke your right to remain silent from that point forward, even if it feels like it's coming a little late, because "I'd like to remain silent from here on" is still a completely valid thing to say partway through an encounter, even after you've already said more than you wish you had. It doesn't erase what was already said, but it stops the situation from getting any worse, and it preserves your ability to have a proper conversation with an attorney afterward about exactly what was said and what it means for whatever comes next. Let's talk about the emotional side of all this for a moment, because I don't want this video to leave anyone feeling like every stop is a high-stakes chess match requiring flawless execution under pressure, because that's not actually the spirit of any of this. The overwhelming majority of traffic stops end exactly the way they would have ended regardless of whether the driver guessed at the reason for the stop or redirected the question calmly back to the officer. A warning, a citation, a brief conversation, and everyone goes on with their evening. This entire video isn't really about the majority of stops. It's about the much smaller number of situations where the difference between guessing and redirecting, between consenting and declining, actually changes what happens next in a meaningful way, and preparing for that smaller number of situations costs you nothing in the majority of stops where it never ends up mattering at all. Knowing these sentences doesn't make you paranoid, and using them doesn't make the encounter tense or unpleasant. It just means that in the rare moment where it actually counts, you're not improvising for the first time under pressure. You already know exactly what to say, and you can say it calmly, warmly, and without a second thought, precisely because you've thought about it well in advance, sitting somewhere calm, long before you ever needed it for real. Let's close by pulling every piece of this back together one final time, because I want the structure sitting clearly in your mind, not scattered across everything we've covered. The question, "Do you know why I stopped you?" is not an invitation to help. It's an invitation to confess, delivered in a tone gentle enough that most people never recognize it as anything other than casual conversation. You are never required to guess at the reason for a stop, and guessing, even with the best of intentions, even out of pure politeness, risks handing over an admission you weren't required to give, sometimes to the wrong thing entirely. The response that protects you completely every single time, without exception, is simple, honest, and costs you nothing. "I'm not sure, officer. What's the reason for the stop?" Say it calmly. Say it warmly. Then let the silence that follows belong to him, not to you. Everything that flows from that single moment follows the same underlying logic. Identify yourself and hand over your documents, because that part is genuinely required, and there's no benefit to resisting it. Comply completely and immediately with every lawful physical order, because that's what keeps the whole encounter safe and short. And beyond those two things, decline calmly, consistently, and without apology. Decline to guess. Decline to narrate your evening. Decline to consent to a search, using the same short, warm, unshakable sentences. No matter how many times, or how many different ways, the same request comes back around. Practice them out loud one more time before you go, because familiarity is what turns these words into instinct instead of something you're inventing from scratch with a flashlight in your eyes and your heart going a little too fast for whatever time of night it happens to be. "I'm not sure, officer. What's the reason for the stop?" "I'd rather not get into that. Am I free to go?" "Officer, I don't consent to any searches. I'm going to remain silent, and I don't consent to any searches." 4 sentences, calm and complete, sitting ready in the back of your mind, whether you ever need them or not. If this filled in a gap you didn't know you had before you clicked play, hit subscribe, because there's plenty more of this coming. The exact wording for exactly the moments that catch even careful, thoughtful people off guard. The ones nobody ever explains clearly until it's already too late to take the answer back. Stay calm out there. Know exactly what that question is really asking of you, and never let a warm tone talk you into supplying an answer that was never yours to give in the first place.